I heard the knock before I saw the flashing blue through the curtains. It was a soft rapping, almost polite, yet it split the quiet of my living room like a blade. For a moment, I thought my heart had mistaken an echo of the past. My late husband used to knock like that when he forgot his keys. But then a voice followed. "Ma'am? Maplewood Police." And just like that, the world I'd spent a lifetime tending tilted in a way I never expected. I was still holding the phone in my hand, the call log open with my son Daniel's name glowing coldly on the screen. 5 minutes earlier, he had shouted something I never imagined hearing from a child I raised with lullabies and lunchbox notes. He said I was interfering, that I was ruining everything, and before I could ask what everything even meant, he hung up. The next sound I heard was the siren. I opened the door slowly, hands trembling a little. 68 years of living teaches you how to hide fear, but it doesn't erase it. The young officer on my porch, his badge read Officer Reeves, looked at me with a mix of caution and sympathy. Behind him, the cruiser hummed, headlights soaking my hydrangeas in harsh white. "I'm not sure why I'm here, ma'am," he said. "We received a call from your son. He said you were refusing to leave his property." I almost laughed, not from humor, but from the absurdity. Property. Daniel hadn't even lived in this house for 17 years, not since he begged to move closer to his college friends. Yet here I was, standing in the doorway of the home I'd paid the mortgage on, with my late husband's pension and my own stitched-together part-time jobs. Still, I felt small, like I had already done something wrong. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of lemon oil. I had been dusting old picture frames when Daniel called. Photos of him as a boy, standing in our yard with his crooked grin, fishing pole too big for his hands. I'd wiped the glass with slow circles, remembering the feel of his small palm wrapped around my fingers. Sometimes love really does fool you into thinking it can't turn. I invited the officer inside because that's how I was raised. No one stands on a porch when you can offer them warmth. He stepped in carefully, looking around in a way that told me he already sensed something was off. The house was tidy, bills stacked by date on the kitchen counter, a mug of chamomile cooling beside my armchair. Nothing about it looked like a place where chaos lived. The past few months had been a quiet unraveling. Daniel had started asking me for temporary help. A loan for a car repair, then a medical bill, then a short-term business investment. Each time he swore he'd pay it back. Each time he brought forms for me to sign without explaining why my signature mattered. I trusted him the way mothers do, blindly and with the softest parts of my heart. It wasn't until I received a notice from the bank, my savings account frozen, due to an ongoing inquiry, that I began piecing things together. Daniel had listed me as a silent guarantor on a business lease he had never told me he opened. He used my address, my credit history, even my phone number. I had called him earlier to ask why. Instead of an explanation, he sent a police officer to my door. Officer Reeves studied my expression. "Ma'am, may I ask, are you safe here? Do you feel threatened in any way?" His sincerity nearly undid me. "No," I said softly. "I'm safe. Just confused." He nodded, then asked if he could see the documents Daniel claimed I was refusing to hand over. I blinked at him. "Documents? I don't have anything of his. I barely even know what he's gotten himself into." The officer exhaled, a slow breath of someone starting to understand the picture forming. He asked permission to check my front yard, to verify whether Daniel's story matched reality. When he walked back in, he shook his head. "There's nothing out there, ma'am. No personal belongings, no signs of a dispute." His shoulders softened. "I think your son may have misunderstood, or misrepresented the situation." Misrepresented, a gentle word for a painful truth. As he spoke, a memory drifted in. My husband handing Daniel a toolbox on his 12th birthday, telling him, A man's character shows in how he fixes what he breaks. I wondered what he'd say now, seeing how loosely our son handled the truth. When the officer prepared to leave, he paused. "If you don't mind my asking, did something change recently between you and your son?" I hesitated. My throat tightened in that familiar way grief always does, gathering just behind the collarbone. "I think," I whispered, "I'm only now beginning to see what changed years ago." He gave me a long, steady look, the kind people offer when they wish they could fix something for you, but know they can't. Then he left, the cruiser's lights fading down the street until only the hum of my refrigerator remained. I closed the door, leaned against it, and let the truth settle like dust. My own son had called the police on me, and though the officer hadn't asked it outright, I felt the question echo inside me like a tolling bell. What do you do when the child you raised becomes a stranger? The answer, I suspected, would change everything. I woke before dawn the next morning, the air cool against my skin, the kind that makes old bones whisper their complaints. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee, staring at the bank notice again. "Account under review," it said in stiff black lettering, as if my entire life's savings were nothing more than a clerical inconvenience. I traced the edge of the paper with my thumb, remembering how many years of coupon clipping and late-night shifts had gone into every dollar. The house was quiet, too quiet. When my husband was alive, mornings were filled with the rustle of newspapers and the soft whir of the coffee maker he always insisted on fixing himself. He'd tap the bottom of the machine and mutter, "It just needs a little understanding." Sometimes I wondered if people were the same way, needing patience, guidance, a gentle hand. Other times, like now, I wondered if I had spent too many years believing that. I pulled out the folder where I kept all my receipts and documents. Electric bills, grocery invoices, tax returns dating back further than any reasonable person would keep them. Habit, I suppose. When you've lived a life where losing one piece of paper could derail a mortgage or a medical claim, you learn to hold on to everything. And somewhere in that pile, I hoped, was an explanation. Instead, I found something else. A copy of a lease agreement Daniel had brought me to sign months ago, saying it was just a routine verification for a storage unit. I remembered feeling a slight hesitation back then, his eyes not quite meeting mine, his voice a little too light. But I signed anyway. A mother's trust is easy prey. Now, reading it again, my stomach tightened. My name wasn't just on the lease. It was the only name. The business address listed was unfamiliar. The monthly payment was high enough to bruise my savings if anything went wrong. And the phone number associated with the account was mine. A small tremor traveled through me, the kind that starts in the hands and works its way inward. I rubbed my palms against my robe and breathed slowly, like the doctor told me to do when memories hit too hard. Around mid-morning, my neighbor Helen knocked on the door with a tin of blueberry muffins. "Saw the patrol car last night?" she whispered, as if the walls themselves might gossip. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Just a misunderstanding." Her eyes softened with that neighborly concern people carry in quiet towns like ours. "Well, if you need anything, dear, you know where I am." She hesitated before leaving. "And don't let people push you around. You're stronger than you think." The words lingered with me long after the door closed. Later, I called Daniel, straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. I typed out a message asking if we could talk, if we could clear up whatever confusion had caused him to call the police on his own mother. No reply, only silence. By afternoon, the sun slanted through the windows in long golden ribbons, lighting up the living room in a way that made the dust sparkle like tiny suspended thoughts. I found myself wandering from room to room, touching the furniture my husband built, the framed letter our daughter wrote before she moved across the country, the small wooden bird Daniel carved when he was 9. Crooked wings, uneven beak, full of charm. I held it in my hands and wondered where that boy had gone. The phone finally rang at sunset. I answered on the first ring. "Mom, I don't have time for this." Daniel's voice snapped on the other end. "You're making it harder than it needs to be." "Harder than what?" I asked, my voice steady but soft. "Daniel, you involved the police. You used my information for something I don't understand. I need you to explain." He sighed, a long, irritated exhale that cut deeper than any sharp word. "It's business, Mom. You wouldn't understand. Just sign the documents I sent you and let me handle it." "I'm not signing anything else," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "Not until I know what's going on." There was a beat of silence and then, "You owe me this." My breath caught. "Owe him?" "Daniel," I whispered. "I've given you everything I could." He muttered something under his breath, something like, "You always make things difficult," and then he hung up. Just like that, as if I were an inconvenience, a roadblock, a number on a ledger he needed to move around. I set the phone down carefully, as though it were something fragile. The last light of the day slipped away, leaving the room dim and still. I felt a slow, steady clarity settle over me. Not anger, not yet, but something quieter and sturdier. For the first time, I wondered if trust could break so slowly you didn't hear the crack until it echoed. Something inside me shifted that night. A small shift, barely a whisper, but enough that I knew the ground beneath my feet was changing, and I would have to change with it. I woke the next morning with a heaviness in my chest, the kind that presses down before your eyes even open. The house was still, but not peaceful, more like a held breath. I padded into the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and watched the steam rise soft and silent, like a reminder that even water cracks under pressure. When I sat at the table, the documents from the night before were still spread out like a map of mistakes I hadn't realized I'd made. I studied the lease again, tracing the bold letters of my name. My signature looked steady and confident, but the woman who had written it, trusting, hopeful, felt miles away from the woman staring at it now. I reached for my planner next, leafing through months of penciled notes. Daniel's doctor appointment reminders, payment confirmation numbers, deadlines for bills I always paid on time. It struck me how many pages were filled with things that weren't mine. It was as if I'd slowly faded from my own life without noticing. Around mid-morning, the phone buzzed with a notification, an email from the bank. My heart lurched before I even opened it. The inquiry into my savings account had expanded, they said. More documents were required. They needed verification for a business loan application linked to my name, a loan I had never applied for. I set the phone down, my hands trembling. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. I steadied myself with slow breaths, the way grief had once taught me to breathe after my husband's funeral. Deep in, slow out, hold the pieces together. I called Daniel again, straight to voicemail. I tried his workplace. A receptionist told me he hadn't been in for several days. Something cold settled in my bones. Not shock this time, but recognition. I had been blind, but not anymore. I gathered every document tied to Daniel, receipts, contracts, text logs where he'd promised payback, and placed them carefully in a large manila envelope. The weight of it felt heavier than paper should. I didn't know exactly what I was preparing for, only that I needed the truth anchored in something real. As I sat with the envelope on my lap, I felt a quiet voice rise inside me, a voice I'd ignored for too long. It asked a question I didn't want to answer but needed to face. Had I taught my son to believe kindness had no boundaries? The doorbell startled me from my thoughts. When I opened the door, my daughter Lydia stood there, her hair pulled into a loose bun, her eyes soft with worry. "Mom, Helen called me. She said she saw a police cruiser here the other night." I stepped aside and let her in. She glanced at the papers spread across the coffee table, and her brow furrowed. "What's all this?" I told her everything. Daniel's call, the officer on the porch, the frozen account, the lease. She listened without interrupting, though her lips tightened and her eyes grew shiny at the edges. When I finished, Lydia sank onto the couch. "Mom," she whispered, "why didn't you tell me earlier?" I didn't want to think the worst," I said. "He's my son." She took my hand gently, the way I used to take hers when she was afraid of thunderstorms. "And you're our mother. You don't have to go through this alone." Her words warmed something inside me, but they also cracked something open. A realization so sharp, it almost felt like guilt. "Have you ever felt something like this?" I asked her softly. "Did you ever realize too late that you were being used?" Her eyes softened even more. "I think we've all ignored red flags from people we love," she said. "But this, Mom, this isn't your fault." We sat in silence for a while, the late afternoon sun casting long beams across the carpet. Lydia eventually helped me organize the documents into clearer sections: bank notices, lease papers, text messages, email confirmations. As she worked, she shook her head slowly, as though seeing pieces of a puzzle she'd never imagined existed. "You need legal advice," she said finally. "Someone who can tell you what's real and what he forged." The word "forged" caught in my chest, heavy and unfamiliar. Daniel had been many things in his life: careless, scattered, always dreaming. But deceitful? That word didn't fit the little boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder after baseball games. But then again, people don't transform in one day. They change slowly, and sometimes we mistake the shifting for growing. By the time Lydia left, the house had fallen quiet again, but it felt different, less lonely, more resolved. The kettle clicked off automatically behind me, startling me out of my thoughts. I poured myself another cup of tea, inhaling the steam as if it could steady me. The envelope of documents sat on the table, waiting patiently. For years, I had told myself that endurance was the same as love, that sacrifice was simply the shape motherhood took. But as the sky darkened and my reflection appeared faintly in the window, I saw someone I hadn't looked for in a long time. A woman who had been patient long enough. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. This wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about finally drawing the line I should have drawn years ago. The first thing I heard was the printer. That thin, stuttering whine as it pulled in another sheet of paper, spitting out black and white proof that my life had been twisted into someone else's plan. It was such an ordinary sound, but that morning, it felt like a drumbeat. Every page that landed on the tray said the same thing in different words. "You've been too trusting." Lydia had helped me the night before, setting up an online account with the bank, so I could print statements myself. Now the dining room table, which once held birthday cakes and Thanksgiving turkeys, was covered in neat rows of paper. Bank statements, email confirmations, screenshots of text messages from Daniel where he promised he'd take care of everything if I just signed. The sun was barely up, a soft gray light spreading through the lace curtains. The digital clock on the stove read 6:12 a.m. I stood there in my robe, watching another page slide out, feeling both fragile and oddly solid at the same time. It's a strange thing when heartbreak and determination arrive in the same breath. After breakfast, 2 slices of toast I barely tasted. I called the number on the back of my bank card. I had written it in my old address book years ago, right under emergencies. I never imagined the emergency would be my own child. A recorded voice guided me through a maze of options until I reached a live person. Her name was Christina. She sounded young, maybe my granddaughter's age, with a voice that tried to be professional but softened when she heard the tremor in mine. "I need to report something," I said. "There are loans and accounts tied to my name that I don't recognize. My savings was frozen. I believe my information was used without my full understanding." She asked for verification, my social security number, the last 4 digits of my account, the answer to the security question my husband and I had chosen years ago, our first pet's name. Saying Rusty out loud brought back the image of our old dog, and for a second, my throat tightened. But I pushed through it. There was no more room left in me for drifting. Christina was quiet for a while as she clicked through my file. I heard her sigh faintly. "Mrs. Harris," she finally said, "I can see a recent business loan application linked to your profile. It was initiated online, but the address and phone number match yours. Did you authorize this?" "No," I said. "I signed some papers my son brought me, but I was told it was for a storage unit. I never agreed to a business loan." She explained that the bank could open a fraud investigation, that there were procedures they had to follow. I listened carefully, wrote everything down in my shaky but neat handwriting. Case number, department name, dates. Every word felt like a stone in the foundation of something new. When she asked if there was anyone else who might have access to my personal information, I paused. "My son," I said quietly. "Daniel Harris. He's used my address, my phone number. I'm not sure what else." She didn't judge. At least, if she did, I couldn't hear it. "We'll note that, ma'am," she said. "You've done the right thing calling us. Keep all your documents in one place. If you receive any notices, letters, or calls about accounts you don't recognize, write down dates and times. It matters." After we hung up, I sat for a moment, letting the silence settle. I looked at the notepad in front of me. The page was full. Call time, representative's name, case number written twice so I wouldn't misread my own handwriting. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a helpless old woman. I felt like a witness. Later that morning, Lydia drove me to a small law office across town. The building was plain red brick, with a faded sign that read, "Matthews and Cole, Attorneys at Law." Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of old coffee and copier ink. A television on the wall played a muted news channel with captions rolling by. We met with a woman named Karen Cole, gray streaks in her dark hair, glasses perched low on her nose. She shook my hand firmly and looked me directly in the eyes in a way that made me feel both exposed and seen. I laid the manila envelope on her desk. "I don't know exactly what I've done," I said, "but I know I signed things I didn't understand. And now the bank is treating me like I'm part of something I never agreed to." Karen listened as I told her about the lease, the police officer at my door, the call from the bank. She flipped through the documents, her eyes moving quickly, occasionally pausing to make a note or underline something. After a long, quiet minute, she said, "Mrs. Harris, from what I can see, your son has used your identity and credit to secure obligations in your name. Some signatures are yours, others—" She held one page up closer, then set it down. "Others may not be." The words hung in the air. I stared at the page, at the version of my signature that looked a little too smooth, a little too practiced. "Is there anything I can do?" I asked. "There is," she said, "but it will take time and resolve. We can dispute these documents. We can involve the bank's fraud department, maybe even law enforcement if necessary. You may also need to protect your assets legally, in case your son tries to lean on you again." Protect my assets. It sounded cold at first, like I was a stranger guarding a vault. But the more she spoke, the more I saw it differently. I wasn't just protecting money. I was protecting the years of my life that had given shape to that money. Late nights, double shifts, saying no to small luxuries so my children could say yes to bigger dreams. Before we left, Karen slid a business card toward me and spoke gently. I know this is painful, but you're not doing this against your son. You're doing this for yourself. There's a difference. On the drive home, the town rolled past the window in familiar colors. The grocery store where I'd once taught Daniel how to compare prices by ounce. The playground where he'd scraped his knees and run to me, crying, only to go back and climb again. The bank branch where I had opened my first account with 20 crumpled dollars. I thought of the officer at my door, asking if I felt safe. I thought of the bank representative telling me to keep records. I thought of the lawyer's steady voice as she said the word protect. Somewhere between the stoplights and the brownstone church, a line quietly formed in my mind. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with fanfare. It was simply there at last. I could not change what Daniel had already done, but I could decide what I would allow from this day forward. And that quiet decision, sitting there in the passenger seat with my hands folded over a small stack of legal papers, felt like the beginning of a plan I hadn't fully shaped yet, but knew deep down I was strong enough to see through. I spent the next morning going through the motions of my routine, watering the plants, folding laundry, checking the mail. But everything felt slightly out of place, as though the world had shifted a few inches to the left and no one had bothered to warn me. Even the air seemed different, carrying a quiet stillness that made me more aware of every sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the hallway clock, the creak of the floorboard near the window I'd been meaning to tighten for months. Halfway through sorting the mail, I froze. An envelope from the leasing company. My name printed neatly on the front, the return address the same one on Daniel's so-called storage unit papers. Inside was a late payment notice, past due, additional fees added, and at the bottom, in bold, guarantor responsibility activated. I stared at those words until they blurred. A part of me still wanted to believe Daniel was simply overwhelmed, confused, caught in something too big for him. But the notices kept coming. Each one told a story he refused to explain. I set the letter gently on the table, smoothing the edges with my palm, and realized that even my body had begun to understand something my heart was still resisting. This was not an accident. This was not a single mistake. This was a pattern. A quiet tapping on the door made me startle. When I opened it, Helen stood on the porch, bundled in her knitted cardigan, holding a grocery bag filled with soup containers and sliced bread. "You didn't look too steady the other day," she said gently. "Thought you might need something warm." It took me a moment to find my voice. "You're kind, Helen. Truly." She set the bag on the kitchen counter and glanced at the scattered documents. "Still sorting through all that?" "Yes," I swallowed. "It's more than I realized." Helen nodded, her eyes softening. "These things rarely start big. They start with one little favor that doesn't feel heavy, then another and another. Before you know it, you're carrying something someone else should have held." Her words sank into me deeply, like seeds finding cracks in stone. After she left, I sat at the table again, surrounded by papers that no longer felt like confusion. They felt like evidence. That afternoon, my landline rang, the one I rarely used except for doctor appointments and utility reminders. The caller ID read, "Maplewood Leasing and Commercial Services." My pulse quickened. "Mrs. Harris?" a crisp voice asked when I answered. "Yes, speaking." "This is Karen from Maplewood Leasing. We've been trying to reach you regarding an overdue business property linked to your account. We're required to notify you that if payment isn't made within 10 days, the case may be escalated to collections. Collections. The word felt heavy, like it carried teeth. I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. I'd like to request copies of all documents tied to that account, I said. Everything with my name or signature. There was a pause. Of course, ma'am, we can email or mail them. Mail, please, I said, and send them certified. Another pause. This time, almost surprised. Yes, certainly. You'll receive them within 5 business days. When I hung up, a small tremor ran through me. Not fear this time, but certainty. I was gathering what I needed, one piece at a time. Late that evening, as I sat in my armchair with the lamp casting a soft glow across the living room, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. We need to talk. Stop involving other people. You're making this worse. Worse. For a long moment, I stared at the screen, feeling something inside me harden. Not bitterness, not anger, but clarity. I typed a slow response. I'm only seeking clarity. You are welcome to explain anything you believe I misunderstand. No reply. I set the phone face down on the table. My hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear, from the weight of finally claiming my own place in the story. As the night deepened, I walked into the spare bedroom, the room Daniel used to sleep in during holidays, when coming home still meant something sweet. The bed was neatly made, the old quilt folded at the foot, untouched. I sat down, letting my fingers trace the stitches my mother had sewn decades ago. Each thread carried a memory. Birthdays, illnesses, late-night talks, the ordinary magic of raising children. I had given Daniel roots, warmth, safety, but at some point he learned to take without asking, and I learned to give without questioning. Something had to change. I looked toward the window where the streetlight outside painted a soft circle of gold on the floor. In that quiet glow, the truth settled softly around me. Not cruel, not sharp, just honest. Daniel wasn't coming to fix this. Daniel wasn't going to undo what he had done. But I could. I rose from the bed, walked back to the dining room table, and gathered the papers into a single stack. Neat edges, aligned corners, a story becoming clearer every day. As I held them, I felt the faintest spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Strength. Not loud or dramatic, just steady like the first step onto solid ground after wandering in fog. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was preparing for it. 2 days later, the certified envelope from the leasing company arrived with a heavy thud in the mailbox. It sounded louder than it should have, echoing down the little metal box like a warning. I carried it inside, carefully, as if it might break open and spill something I wasn't ready to see. At the dining table, I slid it open with a butter knife. Inside were photocopies of every document tied to the business account. There was my name on the lease, my name under primary guarantor, my name on a separate loan application. Some pages held my real signature, hesitant but familiar. Others held a version of it that looked polished, practiced. The loops too even, the pressure too steady. I felt my cheeks grow hot. There is something particularly cruel about seeing your own name used against you. Tucked behind the stack was a payment ledger. Several months of missed payments. Notes in the margin. Caller, Daniel Harris, promised funds by Friday. Another line, later. Caller hostile. Claims guarantor will cover balance. Guarantor. That was me. That was the word he had used me for. I sat very still. The pages spread like a fan across the table. My tea had gone cold, untouched. Outside, a lawnmower droned in the distance, and a delivery truck hissed to a stop somewhere up the street. Ordinary sounds, while my life quietly reorganized itself into a new shape. Then my phone vibrated. A new message from Daniel. "You got the documents. Just pay this month, I'll handle the rest. Stop talking to lawyers. You're making it worse for both of us." For a long moment, I just looked at the words, the expectation in them, the casual way he assumed I would just fold like paper. I opened the photo app instead. I began taking pictures of everything: the lease, the loan application, the ledger with its notes, even the envelope with the postmark. I zoomed in on dates, signatures, the little scribbles in the margins written by strangers who knew my son only as a voice on the other end of the line. When I finished, I backed them all up to the cloud Lydia had set up for me. She had labeled the folder Mom's Important Stuff. Somehow that made me smile. By mid-afternoon, the weight in my chest had shifted from confusion to something quieter, steadier. Resolve. I picked up the phone and called the non-emergency police number printed in small letters on the refrigerator magnet Officer Reeves had left after that first night. "Maplewood Police, how can I help you?" a dispatcher asked. I cleared my throat. "My name is Margaret Harris," I said. "An officer came to my house last week after my son called. I believe I need to make a report now. About identity theft. About fraud. I have documents." The dispatcher took my information and told me an officer could meet me at the station if I was able to come in. I looked at the stack of papers, at my house that had always felt like a shelter, and realized this was bigger than these walls now. "Yes," I said. "I can come." The station was cooler than I expected, all pale linoleum and humming fluorescent lights. I held my envelope against my chest like a shield. A young woman at the front desk took my name and asked me to wait. Above her, a digital clock flicked from 2:59 to 3 Hunquak, each minute louder than the last. After a few moments, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Officer Reeves. He looked slightly different in the harsh indoor lighting, less dramatic than he had on my porch that night. But the same calm steadiness was in his eyes. "Mrs. Harris," he said, offering a small, respectful nod. "Good to see you again. I wish it were under better circumstances." He led me to a small interview room with a rectangular table, 2 chairs, and a camera mounted in the top corner. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, like the lawyer's office had. Papers and machines. That's what the world seems to run on in times like these. He set a thin form in front of me. "This is just to document your statement," he said. "We'll attach any evidence you have. Take your time." I told him everything, how Daniel had brought me papers to sign months ago, how I'd believed they were routine verifications, how the bank had called, how the leasing company had sent notices, how the certified envelope had arrived that morning. I showed him the copies, the ledger, the mismatched signatures. He listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting down notes. Every now and then, he would ask a simple, clarifying question. "About what date was that? Did you give your son permission to apply for loans using your name? Were you aware the business was solely in your name?" The last question made me pause, my hands folded around each other, fingers lacing tightly. "No," I said. "I did not know. I would never have agreed to that." When I finished, there was a long quiet, the kind where you become aware of your own breathing, of the faint buzz of the light overhead, of the way your heart feels a little too loud in your chest. Officer Reeves closed his notebook gently. Then he looked at me with that same blend of professionalism and human concern I'd seen before. "Mrs. Harris," he said quietly, "based on what you've shown me, this meets the definition of a crime. Identity theft. Fraud. Because it's your son, this is complicated, but the law doesn't change because of blood." I swallowed hard. Every part of me wanted to look away, to retreat back into the familiar story where mothers cover, excuse, explain. He waited a moment, then asked the one thing that seemed to tilt the room just slightly, like the ground itself had shifted. "Do you want this officially recorded as a crime?" he asked. "Against your son, not just a family misunderstanding, a formal report." There it was. For a moment, I felt like I was standing in two lives at once. In one, I said no, and we went back to the old pattern, me quietly absorbing the fallout of his choices, hiding bank letters in drawers. In the other, I said yes, and nothing would ever be the same between us again. I thought of my husband's hands, rough from years of work, smoothing our children's hair when they were small. I thought of the first time Daniel rode his bike without training wheels, how he'd looked back to make sure I was watching. I thought of the late-night calls asking for just a little help, and the way guilt had become the language we spoke. I also thought of the bank freezing my savings, of the leasing company's ledger, of Daniel's message telling me I was making things worse by protecting myself. Very slowly, I lifted my eyes to the officers. "Yes," I whispered, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I want it recorded. I want it on the record that I did not agree to this, that it was wrong." He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll open a formal case. You'll get a report number before you leave. You may be contacted by a detective. I'm going to also give you a packet about identity theft, how to place fraud alerts, how to get a copy of your credit reports. It's a lot, but you don't have to do it all today." He slid a stapled packet across the table. Victim Resource Guide. Pages of phone numbers, instructions, sample dispute letters. I traced the printed words with my finger. This was the world I was stepping into now. Not as a helpless old woman, not as a burden. As a citizen with rights. He stood to walk me back to the front, then paused at the door. "Ma'am," he said, "this isn't about being a bad mother or a good mother. This is about being fair to yourself. You're allowed to be protected, too." On the drive home, Lydia's hands clenched the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. "How do you feel?" she asked. I looked out the window at the passing houses, at the families unloading groceries, at a boy on a skateboard wobbling down the sidewalk. My reflection in the glass looked both older and somehow clearer. "Like I finally stepped out of a story I didn't write," I said softly. That night, sitting alone in my living room with the incident report number written neatly on an index card beside me, I thought about all the times in my life I had put myself last without question, all the times I'd believed that love meant carrying weight until my knees shook. Have you ever realized, far too late, that the person you were protecting wasn't even trying to stand on their own? The thought settled over me like a blanket, not comforting, but honest. And in that honesty, I felt something loosen inside, just enough for a new kind of breath. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, I knew whose side I was on, my own. In the days that followed my visit to the police station, the house felt different, quieter, but no longer in that suffocating way. More like the calm after a storm, when the air is thick but strangely clean. I found myself listening for things I'd missed before. The rustle of wind through the maple tree, the rhythmic clack of the radiator turning on, the simple hum of living alone. It felt as if the walls, long accustomed to absorbing my silence, were finally breathing with me. I kept all my documents on the dining table, sorted into careful stacks the way Karen, the attorney, had shown me. Every morning I would choose one small task, call the credit bureau, scan another set of documents, check the bank portal for updates. None of it was dramatic. It was slow, methodical work, the kind that doesn't give you satisfaction all at once. More like tending a garden. You clear the weeds a little at a time, trusting the roots beneath the soil to hold. One afternoon, I received an email from the bank's fraud department requesting a detailed timeline of events. I sat at my computer, hands poised above the keyboard, suddenly uncertain where the beginning even was. When did Daniel cross the line? Was it the first time he borrowed money and forgot to pay it back? Was it the first time he asked me to sign something without fully explaining it? Or was the true beginning much further back, when I first taught him that I would always fix things, even when he broke them carelessly? I typed slowly, carefully. Dates, receipts, conversations. I attached scanned copies of every form, every letter, every notice. When I hit send, I expected fear to rise in my throat. Instead, I felt steady, as if each piece I sent made the truth harder to ignore, harder to twist. Later that week, Lydia came over after work carrying 2 paper bags of groceries. "You shouldn't be lifting heavy things," she said before I could protest. "And you haven't been eating enough vegetables." I smiled. "You sound like me in the 90s. She placed the groceries on the counter, then leaned back against it, arms crossed. "Mom, have you heard from him at all?" I shook my head. The last message I'd received from Daniel was short, sharp, and full of the same expectation he always carried. Since then, silence. No apologies, no explanations, not even anger. And yet, the quiet felt heavier than anything he could have said. "He'll reach out eventually," Lydia said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Especially once he realizes things aren't going the way he planned." I didn't answer. I didn't want to imagine what Daniel was doing now, whether he was scrambling to find a new guarantor, or telling others a story where he was the victim and I, the unreasonable mother. Truth twists easily in the mouths of those who need it to. That evening, after Lydia left, I settled into my armchair with a blanket draped over my legs. Outside, the sky was turning a soft lavender, the last of the daylight fading through the sheer curtains. I was just beginning to relax when my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Harris?" a male voice asked. "This is Detective Harlow with the Maplewood Police Department. I'm following up on your identity theft report." My heart thudded once, hard. "Yes, of course." He explained that they had reviewed the initial documents Officer Reeves submitted. They needed additional information, exact dates, witness statements if available, and clarification on which signatures were unquestionably mine. He asked if I could bring the originals to the station within the next few days. I told him I could come tomorrow. After we hung up, I placed the phone gently on the table and sat back, pressing my palms together. The room felt still, as though holding its breath with me. For so many years, I had moved quietly through life, smoothing over conflicts before they grew, keeping peace even at the cost of my own voice. Now, sitting there on the edge of something I couldn't fully name, I realized I was no longer smoothing anything. I was confronting it. The next morning, I dressed carefully. Dark slacks, a soft blue sweater, the necklace my husband gave me the Christmas before he passed. Not to impress anyone. Just to remind myself of who I was before fear clouded my judgment. Before guilt tied my hands. At the station, Detective Harlow greeted me with a firm handshake. He was older than I expected, maybe in his 50s, with kind eyes that softened when I sat down. He reviewed my documents with slow, precise movements, pausing occasionally to ask questions. When he held up one of the forged signatures, he glanced at me. "Is this yours?" "No," I said. The word came easier than I thought it would. "It looks similar, but it isn't." He nodded. "This helps." I watched him slide the page into a labeled evidence sleeve. Seeing my life reduced to ink and paper felt surreal, but not painful the way it had before. These pages weren't proof of my failure as a mother, they were proof of a wrong being put right. When the meeting ended, Detective Harlow walked me to the lobby. "We may be contacting your son for questioning," he said. "I want to prepare you for that possibility." A faint chill passed through me, though not enough to weaken my steps. "I understand." "If he contacts you," the detective added, "don't engage. Direct him to us. Let everything go through official channels." Official channels. Words that once would have scared me. Now they felt like a railing I could hold on to. As I stepped outside, the afternoon sun warmed my face. Cars passed, people walked by carrying shopping bags or talking on their phones, the ordinary world going on as always. But something inside me had shifted into a new alignment. Not angry, not broken, just sure. Back home, I placed my folder gently on the table and exhaled. The house no longer felt like a cage or a battlefield. It felt like a place preparing for something new. And late that night, as I stood by the window looking out at the quiet street, a question rose inside me. Soft, reflective, unafraid. Did you ever notice the exact moment when you stopped being afraid of someone you loved? Because standing there in the dim glow of the street lamp, I knew I had crossed that moment, and the world, somehow, felt larger. The morning after meeting with Detective Harlow, I woke with an unexpected sense of clarity, like a window that had been fogged for months had finally been wiped clean. The world outside was pale and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a snowfall, even though the calendar insisted it was spring. I brewed a pot of coffee and let the smell fill the house, warm and familiar. It reminded me of the life I'd built long before any of this trouble began. After breakfast, I gathered the documents I no longer needed to carry back and forth, the copies, the extra notes, and placed them in a small wooden box my husband once used to store his watch collection. For years it sat untouched in our closet, waiting for someone to give it purpose again. I found myself tracing the carved edges, remembering how we used to polish it every December before the holiday gatherings. He cared for small things that way. It was something I'd always admired. Around noon, my phone buzzed with an email notification, a response from the bank's fraud department. They had completed a preliminary review and found significant inconsistencies in the loan application. They were suspending all associated accounts while the investigation continued. At the bottom, in bold lettering, was a note: "Client liability on hold pending verification." For the first time in weeks, I felt my lungs expand fully. I wasn't free yet, but the weight was beginning to lift. I forwarded the message to Karen, the attorney. Within minutes, she responded, "Good, this is progress. Keep every communication. We'll build from here." Progress. What a gentle, hopeful word. That afternoon, I stepped outside to sweep the porch. The air was cool, crisp enough to nip at my cheeks. As I swept, my neighbor Helen walked by with her little terrier tugging at the leash. She waved, her eyes bright with that familiar mix of worry and affection. "You're looking stronger," she said. "I feel stronger," I admitted. "Good," she replied. "Sometimes it takes a storm to show us the weak branches." I watched her walk down the sidewalk, sunlight catching in her silver hair, and felt gratitude settle softly in my chest. Small kindnesses had carried me through this when I didn't even know I was being carried. Inside the house, the phone began to ring. I recognized the number immediately, even though I hadn't seen it in days. Daniel. I stared at the screen as it lit up the dark wooden counter. The sound echoed through the house, bouncing off walls that had grown accustomed to quiet. It rang once, twice, 3 times, until I finally pressed the button, not to answer, but to silence it. He didn't leave a message. A minute later, a text arrived. "We need to fix this. You're blowing it out of proportion. Call me." I didn't call. Instead, I took a slow, steady breath and turned the phone face down. The truth was no longer something I was afraid of confronting. And Daniel's panic didn't undo the choices he'd made. Choices carved into contracts, loan applications, months of deception. Later that day, I drove to the local grocery store. The automatic doors slid open with their usual mechanical sigh, and I felt a surprising wave of comfort at the sight of the produce aisle, the soft hum of freezer units, the quiet murmur of neighbors chatting near the bakery. Ordinary life, steady and uncomplicated, had become a kind of refuge. As I placed apples into my cart, a familiar voice called out, "Mrs. Harris?" I turned to see a young woman named Emily who worked at the pharmacy counter. She used to help my husband pick up his prescriptions. Her face softened when she saw me. "Haven't seen you in a bit," she said kindly. "Everything all right?" It struck me then how many people had touched the edges of my life without ever knowing the storms inside it. I smiled gently. "I'm getting there," I said, "one thing at a time." After checking out, I returned home to find another envelope in the mailbox, this one from a debt collection agency, addressed to me. I carried it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it. Inside was a notice claiming I owed nearly $12,000. The letter demanded immediate payment. My hands didn't tremble this time. I reached for my notepad, wrote down the sender's name, the account number, the date, the reference code. Then I filed the letter with the others. It was evidence now, not a threat. I emailed Karen, attaching a photo of the notice. She responded almost instantly. "Do not call them. I'll handle this. Forward all future communications to me." I leaned back in my chair, the wooden legs creaking softly beneath me. The sun was beginning to set, casting long gold lines across the kitchen floor. I let the light fall over me, warming my hands. There was a time when a letter like that would have unraveled me, sent me spiraling into fear and self-blame. But now I felt something else entirely. Calm. Not because the trouble was behind me, it wasn't, but because I finally trusted myself to walk through it. Step by step, document by document, truth by truth. That evening, as the light faded and the house settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, I found myself thinking not about Daniel, but about the woman I had been before all of this began. A woman who had spent decades keeping the peace, smoothing the rough edges of other people's choices, carrying burdens that weren't hers. But now she was someone who gathered evidence, someone who spoke to detectives with a steady voice, someone who protected her future with the same care she had once given to everyone else's. As I turned off the lamp and made my way down the hallway, I paused by the framed photo of my husband, the one where he stood in the backyard, smiling with sawdust on his shirt. "I'm trying," I whispered, and for the first time since he left this world, I felt as though he would have been proud, not because I was fighting, but because I had finally remembered I was worth fighting for. The call came late in the evening, just as I was folding fresh laundry in the quiet rhythm that always soothed me. The phone buzzed once, twice. I didn't recognize the number, but something in me, an instinct built over a lifetime, knew I should answer. "Mrs. Harris?" a voice asked. "This is Detective Harlow. We've contacted your son regarding the ongoing investigation." My breath caught, but I kept my voice steady. "And?" "He denied everything at first," the detective said. "Then he claimed the signatures were authorized, that you gave him permission, that you'd simply forgotten." A pause. But once we informed him we had the originals and that a forensic specialist would examine them, he became agitated. I closed my eyes, letting the words settle like falling dust. I had expected anger, excuses, maybe even tears. But agitation, that somehow felt the truest reflection of who Daniel had become. "Thank you," I whispered. "We'll keep you updated," he said. "In the meantime, continue documenting everything." When I hung up, the silence in the house felt different. Not empty, but open, as though it had been waiting for me to reclaim it. I set the last folded towel on the couch and walked into the kitchen. The kettle clicked on automatically as if sensing I needed warmth. Steam began to curl upward, soft and slow, and I let the sound fill the room. A moment later, a new text message appeared on my phone, this time from Daniel. "I didn't mean for any of this to get out of hand. You could have come to me. You didn't need to involve the police. We're family." Family. The word landed heavily, like a coat that used to fit, but no longer felt like mine. I read the message 3 times before setting the phone aside. For years, that word had been the rope he pulled to keep me tied to his needs. But now it simply felt like a word, one I no longer needed to wrap around myself, to feel whole. The next morning, I met with Karen, my attorney, to review the newest developments. Her office felt less intimidating now. The walls weren't closing in the way they had the first time. She poured me a cup of tea and spread the documents carefully across her desk. "The bank is leaning toward confirming identity misuse," she said. "With the police involved, the leasing company has backed off collections for now. You're protected." I exhaled slowly. Protected. The word felt like a warm blanket laid gently across my shoulders. "Daniel has reached out to me again," I said quietly. Karen nodded, unsurprised. "He's realizing the consequences. But remember, you're not required to respond. Communication can go through official channels." "I know," I said. "And I think I need it that way." She smiled gently. "That clarity is important." When I left her office, the sun was shining, bright but not harsh, painting the parking lot in soft gold. I stood for a moment, letting the warmth hit my face. There was still sadness inside me. Yes, but it no longer had claws. It no longer dictated the shape of my days. Over the next week, small shifts began to bloom in my life. Not dramatic changes, but quiet ones. Things I hadn't realized I had been missing. I joined a morning walking group at the community center. The women were around my age, some older, some younger, all with stories etched into the lines of their hands and the softness around their eyes. We talked about books we'd read, aches in our knees, casseroles gone wrong, grandchildren who called too much or too little. Ordinary things, healing things. I also attended a workshop on financial security for seniors, held at the library. The presenter spoke plainly about fraud, scams, boundaries. There was no shame in the room, only shared understanding. I took notes, not because I feared repeating old mistakes, but because I was building something new. A sturdier life. A life with rails instead of open edges. One evening, after a long walk with Helen and her little terrier, I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the street settle into twilight. Fireflies blinked above the grass. A child's laughter echoed faintly from 2 houses down. The world felt soft again. My phone buzzed once more. A final message from Daniel. "Mom, I don't understand why you're doing this. Please, just call me. We can fix this quietly." I read it slowly. Then I placed the phone face down and folded my hands in my lap. The sky above me darkened from lavender to navy, stars emerging one by one. For years, I had mistaken silence for peace and sacrifice for love. But now, sitting there in the cool night air, I understood something deeply. Sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is step out of the old story and refuse to play her part in it anymore. I closed my eyes and let out a long, steady breath. Have you ever reached a moment when you realized the door behind you no longer led anywhere worth returning to? It was that kind of moment. And when I opened my eyes again, the path ahead of me, quiet, simple, my own, felt brighter than anything I had walked in a long, long time. In the days that followed, Daniel's messages stopped. The investigation continued without my involvement. Karen handled the calls, the paperwork, the decisions. I went to the farmer's market with Lydia, baked blueberry muffins for the walking group, and even started repainting the hallway, a soft cream color that made the house glow. Life didn't return to what it had been before. It grew into something different, something steadier, something that belonged to me. One Sunday morning, I stood in the kitchen, sunlight warming the tiles beneath my bare feet, and felt a quiet peace settle gently inside me. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was. The story that began with fear and confusion had become something else entirely. A reclamation, a reminder, a new chapter written by my own hand. And as I washed the breakfast dishes, I whispered softly, "I'm here. I'm whole. I'm finally home again." Thank you for listening to my story, for walking beside me through every twist and quiet revelation. If my journey spoke to you, I'd be grateful if you liked and subscribed so we can continue finding strength together. And before you go, I want to ask you one thing. If you were in my place, what would you have done?